Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we talk to Adam Collins. The London-based Victorian cricket commentator, broadcaster, podcaster and author is back in Australia for another summer of cricket, and also to promote his new book, Bedtime Tales for Cricket Tragics, which was written with his good mate and pod host Jeff Lemon and is being released next week. But Collins, who was once named Cricket Broadcaster of the Year in the UK, and who last year helped Australian all-rounder Glenn Maxwell write his memoir, The Showman, also had another life in politics. A long-time Labor Party member, he spent his 20s in Canberra on the staff of Treasurer Wayne Swan, as well as being a media advisor to then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Recorded on the eve of the first test against England in Perth, after a morning spent watching the Aussie team warm up in the nets, Collins is joined on today's episode by his old friend and chief cricket correspondent for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, Dan Brettig. The pair reflecting on the series yet to come and offering a few choice Ashes predictions. Thanks, Conrad, and welcome to Adam Collins.
Hello, Dan. Nice to sit opposite you to do something like this.
Tell me, Adam, how did you get into politics?
Politics, for me, was something that I drifted into, then got very involved very quickly. So a bit of a well-worn path, really. Joined the Labor Party. Actually, before I went to uni, I was in the States doing my final year of high school as an exchange student and joined the Victorian ALP online. And then when I got back to Australia and I was setting up to go to Monash University, and upon arriving there, it took like 10 minutes to join the Labor Club, you know what I mean? And one thing led to another.
What year was that? Like, what was going on in politics at the time that made you want to join?
Yeah, that's 2003. So I'm at high school. I started high school in 1997, so a year after the Howard government was elected. It's kind of hard to pinpoint one thing now, but through the duration of the Howard government as a kid in high school, I suppose you get exercised by various things. Remember the 2001 election? I was living abroad by that point, but that was the election that was defined by what was going on with refugee policy, famously the Tampa and all the various bits and pieces that sadly followed thereafter. It was not long after September 11 as well, which wasn't the same thing, but was all bundled up as far as the way the politics were working at the time. And by the time I was, reaching that stage where I was an adult and doing my own thing, I felt like it was something that I was always destined to do, really, to be involved in politics in some way. I'd always read it, was tearing through the newspapers or, reading various political books, whatever I get my hands on when I was a kid. It felt like the right place for me to be, and it proved correct. I got great opportunities through politics professionally, but really more importantly than that, got to work on some great campaigns and make some friends that will be lifelong relationships. So even though I'm way removed from it now, I'm still involved in the margins of the party, but not in sort of day-to-day, week-to-week fashion, because I can't be from 10,000 miles away living in London. However, the people who I became friends with in my late teens and early 20s, they're among the people I'll be friends with for the rest of my days.
You were one of the many, young Turks swept into Canberra with Kevin 07, and you were learning. Well, you were growing up at the same time as you were dealing in some pretty big issues in Canberra. So, what do you reflect on that element of, growing up in and around Canberra?
It was pretty rugged, and at the time, I didn't appreciate that it was. It took until 2 or 3 years out of it to start considering what my 20s had been, which was slavish devotion to the cause, right, and to the people I was working with, and so on, which is fine. No regrets or any of that. But it was an enormous commitment at a young age. I went up to Canberra at 23. On reflection, I was too young to have the jobs that I had that came a little bit after that. In my mid-20s, getting to do more senior roles through until when we were voted out in 2013. So I was 29 when it all finished, and that now to me as a 41-year-old sounds preposterous that I did all of these various things, and they were incredible things to be part of. at that young age when, we often talk about it in the context of cricketers now, don't we, about their prefrontal cortex hasn't completely fused yet when they're playing for Australia from time to time. So it was for me. But it didn't impede my ability to sort of learn on the job, learn quickly. I was always good at learning and applying what I'd learnt in various parts of my life even before then. But yeah, I wasn't sort of out of my depth at all, I don't think. It didn't feel like I was anyway. But it took until some years later to realise that it took a massive toll on me emotionally and took quite a while to, I think, adjust from not being a day-to-day political operative.
Sport is obviously a part of life in politics and in and around Canberra, nowhere near to the same degree it is for you now. But tell us a bit about, in particular, the New Year's function that the cricket team has at Kirribilli House every year these days. Yeah,
well, that goes back some time. 2009, there was a final being played at the Gabba between Brisbane and Carlton. And by that point, with Rudd, I was kind of his de facto sports advisor as well, which was a great opportunity because it got me into the hustle and bustle of policy a bit more than the show that I was involved in. And by the show, I mean the comms, politics, media, hustle and bustle. This was more on the policy side, that role that I would moonlight in, you could say. And one of the things I did in it was go to sporting events with Rudd. The 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing was an early taste of that. Then, lots of football, cricket and so on. And in that aforementioned football final, on the way back, Carlton had ceded a big lead in the last quarter. Brisbane ran over the top of them. Rudd had a great night. He was in the circle with the Brisbane team singing the song at the end. We didn't know this then, but he'd been flashed up on the screen many, many times on television celebrating goals, and some of those pics still come back to haunt me to an extent because I look ridiculous sitting next to him. But I digress. No, on the way back, I just pitched to him. I said, you know what we could do in the summer, given how much you're enjoying this sport caper, why don't we try and do something at Kirribilli House on New Year's Day with the cricket team and whoever's touring that year? And he's like, go for it. Do what you need to do, and spoke to Cricket Australia, and they were thrilled at being able to do something like that in that gorgeous house at Kirribilli, and so it's been a tradition thereafter. So it was just honestly, it was nothing more than a brainwave, and I just happened to be at the right place at the right time with the PM in a good mood, and now it's turned into I wouldn't say a major part of the cricketing summer. I wouldn't say but it is a tradition. Like if that were to stop now, would it be a thing? And the teams are there every year. I mean, last year I was at Kirribilli for it. I was a guest of the government at that particular function, and watching Sam Constas having played his first Test match, what was it, a week before, and working with talking to Virat Kohli at great length. It was quite the thing, and it's not often that players are able to do that in that unguarded way. It's not a media event per se, so it's a nice little thing that now happens each year, and happy to have some background with it.
There's obviously a debate that continues to bubble on all the time about don't get sport into politics, don't get politics into sport. You obviously were bestride both those worlds. What do politicians think of sport? Like, what's its role for them, and what's its value?
Well, the first thing to say is the keep politics away from sport typically is when a politician doesn't want athletes saying things they don't like, right? That tends to be the rhythm of these things. I'm not saying that one side of politics is always guilty of that, but that's in my experience following it and covering it, how it goes. How do politicians interpret sport? It's a great opportunity to connect with people who don't typically pay attention to the bouncing ball of daily politics. Sport is far more popular than politics, let's be honest. So that might sound cynical, but I also think it's quite important from a democratic perspective to be where your voters are, to be where your constituents are. And oftentimes your constituents are ensconced within sporting clubs or within sporting teams, and politicians play an important role in advocacy and making the case for budget funding, for instance. If a new set of cricket nets are erected, it's probably because the local club has made representations to the local Member of Parliament, who in turn has made a budget bid to the minister, and that's how the baby is made, right? So that is important, that you're able to be seen to be delivering to sport in that way locally. I think at a higher level, though, politicians at a senior level who are governing the country, they see it as a great way to connect on a much higher level, being engaged in ways that they are engaged watching national teams play or watching the grand final or whatever it is, it does provide an extra layer of connection. I know that that's seen cynically by many people. I know that when prime ministers go out and present trophies and so on, they get booed, which I think, by the way, is a great part of the national tradition. I don't think that's a partisan response from a crowd. You'll often see it reported, well, the premier or the prime minister was booed by the crowd. That means this, that and the other. I reckon I'd boo the PM if I were, not because I don't have any regard for the prime minister. It's a tradition to boo the PM when they go out and present an award. It's just part of the way we're brought up, and I think part of the Australian culture that we like to keep politicians in check, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. When you you're getting towards the end of the time in Canberra, you not quite a gap year, but you're at the London Olympics, and you're basically managing a sport at the Olympics. How does that come about? And was it good to get out of the bubble and be at those games?
It was. I'm a massive Olympophile, as you know, Dan. So when they were asking for applicants for 6-month contracts for jobs, I was on, basically a sabbatical from politics. That's how I described it. At the time, I'd made commitments to Wayne Swan, who was my boss, and I remain very close to as a mentor, and always will. I'd said to him that I was just burnt out, and that was the truth of it. By the middle of 2011, I had spent 4 years running around doing what one does in politics, and I think it had taken, as I said before, taken a toll without me realising it, and I just knew I needed to be out of there for a while. I knew the London Olympics were on. I'd been in London in 2005 when they'd won the bid, famously. I was in Trafalgar Square that day, which was an amazing life experience when the bid came through and they'd won. So I'd always wanted to be there for it, and I didn't anticipate going to London and getting a job working on the organising committee. That was an absolute bonus. And knowing it was a short-term thing, the greasy pole of any employment, any place of employment where you're thinking about the next job or the next thing, there was none of that. All we had to do was deliver an amazing event and a great Olympic Games and the best Olympics ever and that type of thing. And playing a small role in that machine was lovely and restorative for me at the time. And more generally, it meant that I got a chance to live in London for that 12-month period, and I felt like I hadn't quite gotten that out of my system. So when politics ended, I had one eye to how I could get back to the UK, and one thing leads to another. Wife, kids, mortgage, London life. That's very much the one I occupy now, more than a decade on.
Yeah. Obviously, the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government comes to an end late in 2013, and we actually meet in December 2013 at the Adelaide Test match through a mutual friend, Matt Clemo. You were clearly at that stage thinking about the next thing. You weren't sure what was coming next for you.
Yeah, that's right. I'd written an essay for Wayne in his name. The backstory is that in the last year of what was the Gillard then Rudd government, it was pretty obvious that it was going to take something remarkable for the government to be returned at the election. It was within the realms of possibility that Tony Abbott could have blown himself up politically, sure, but if you were simulating that election, it would have gone the way of the opposition most times from where we'd been in the polls and the difficulties we'd had politically with the not so much being a minority government that actually served the government quite well, I felt, but issues that we'd collected along the way and a general sense that our time was up. So I spoke to Wayne in the December of 2012, around the time that, and this will probably be remembered by about 6 people, but we ditched our return to surplus promise at the very end of 2012, which was a massive political issue at the time, that the Labor government had committed to returning to surplus in 2013, and we'd stuck to that promise, and Wayne had to jettison it, and it was a big deal for him. He hated doing it, and it was another sign that we were struggling politically, that this promise had to go, even though he handled it very well in hindsight. Anyway, I, over the Christmas period, said to him, this might be the last few months you have in this role. Now, your political career could be coming to an end pretty soon because you'll be part of the outgoing government, and who knows what happens after that. Yeah, maybe you should play a few more shots on a wider variety of issues in this dismount period, if it is the end. And he's basically agreed. And he gave me the latitude to write some things, and I immediately seized that opportunity and wrote an essay which was released on the 25th of January 2013, 2013 it must have been. So yeah, the day before Australia Day. And it was an essay that was like 4,000 words, which we reduced back to about 1,500 words so it could go on the op-ed pages of the Age and the Herald, which ended up therefore on the front of the page, or front of the paper, sorry, as a news point, that in this essay I'd linked together with Wayne 80 years since the Bodyline series, which was coming up to that 32, 33 anniversary, latent republicanism and the extent to which what happened at Bodyline informs Republican sentiment at the time, and the call to action from Wayne that we should use this as an opportunity to renew our call for an Australian republic. That the debate had gone cold, and as Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer, he wanted to kickstart the debate, and it could not have gone any better. The coverage was amazing. It led to TV news, I reckon, that night as well. It was just one of these things that right place, right time, right story, and it worked. And, Wayne was encouraging of me to do more of that type of thing. We did a few more Republican things in 2013. But the reason I raised all of that, it planted a seed in the back of my mind that, maybe writing about cricket might not be a bad shout. I mean, yes, this was political in its leaning, but fundamentally I was writing a potted history of what happened in a cricket series between Australia and England, right? So when it all ended politically, when kind of considering what I might do, not necessarily with the rest of my life, but what was next anyway, it was rattling around in my head that I might do something in relation to cricket. And the first thing that I wrote ended up enjoying remarkable timing, where the piece was about, it was one of those things, and I'm sure you've been there, Dan, where it's like 10 o'clock at night. I had some thoughts in my head. I committed them to paper. Before I know it, I had a column. It probably wasn't very good, but it was a column. And the next day I had these relationships in politics in Canberra in the media, which I was able to leverage to get it published by the ABC, which I didn't really expect when I started the morning.
Was the drum, wasn't it?
It was the drum, yeah. Rest in peace. I don't know if that's there at all anymore. Certainly parts of the drum don't exist in the way that it used to. And yeah, that opinion section was there for all to write on. And the next day, George Bailey scored 100. So Australia woke up to a piece that was talking up George Bailey's prospects as a Test cricketer as he'd made a ton for the Aussie one-day team in India, and it just took off. And I guess I had a fair bit of support from friends and whatnot in the media who pushed it around, and the ABC very kindly at the time gave me the chance to write about the Ashes of 13-14. And again, I just sort of stumbled into this gig as a columnist without really meaning it. And that was around the same time I was meeting people like yourself, and I thought that it took me a while to really have a go at it full time. I had another job in the middle of that, but yeah, I think then I knew that this was the next thing I really wanted to have a crack at. Yeah,
well, I was going to say in reference to that, proximity is a big thing in any job or career choice. And the fact that I remember you and I spending, I think it was Easter 2014 weekend, we spent quite a bit of time together around that. And I think we might even have dreamed up the Greatest Season That Was podcast.
I reckon we went to the library, didn't we? Yeah. I've got a feeling that you and I, in the middle of this fairly debauched Easter weekend, out and about, that kind of, out and about the dance floor, whatever it was. I think we spent an afternoon in the Melbourne Cricket Club library looking at what source materials there were on this idea at the time for a book, which morphed into a podcast a few years later with our friend Shannon Gill.
Yeah. So fast forward, it was about 18 months, I think, there where you were, you're working for the super fund. Yep. You were finding it a little bit of a drag. And then you decide, right, I'm taking the plunge. I'm going to the West Indies in 2015 and I'll figure out if I can get enough work.
Yeah, so, I mean, it wasn't that I found super a drag in the slightest. It was more just like I think I was restless. I'd worked in this high-octane environment of federal politics. You're sort of living in your suit 6.5 days a week. It's 5 a.m. wake-ups and, you're not going to bed till after late line. Again, rest in peace. You are wired, and there is an addictive element to that. And I've learnt quite a lot about my personality and my hardwiring in recent years as well. I've talked about it on my podcast that last year I learnt formally that I have a degree of neurodivergence, ADHD to be precise, which I knew nothing about until a couple of years ago. ADHD was the kid who pulled the teacher's hair, not the kid that was, in my case, doing quite well in school and university and that type of thing. But I suppose it comes in all different types of forms. But no, the reason I state that is that when I was in a slower paced environment, I struggled to remain stimulated. And I sort of sensed that having worked on the other side of journalists when in politics, that becoming a journalist myself might meet that meet that criteria and scratch that itch. And so it proved. I mean, I've been in the industry now for 11 years. And what you say there, that jump off point when I'd finished in Super, was giving myself a couple of months run up to see what was what. Still very nervous about my voice and my writing. By my voice, I mean what I was writing. I've since gone into broadcasting, but then it was more about what I was getting commissions to do in magazines and that type of thing. And deciding that, you know what, if I'm going to do this, I've got to go all in. So all in meant a 27-hour flight to the other side of the world, holing up in any accommodation I could get my hands on, sharing accommodation with people like yourself who kindly looked after me in the early days, and then just tearing into it and getting any work that was available to me and seeing what would happen. And it proved to be a fairly eventful, what was it? Because the Windies series started in end of May, and I was still on the road at the end of September when Australia finished up in England. So it was a really intense period of time where I made a lot of the connections and friendships which endure and have been the basis of the work that I've done since.
One quick funny digression from that West Indies tour was I think it was the first day of the first test. And given that we were on the other side of the world from Australia you felt like you had a bit of time to write, I think it got to about 9 p.m. that night and I asked you, how are you going? Because we were sharing some accommodation.
Yeah. And
you're like, I'm going really well. I'm absolutely dominating. It's going great. I've almost finished my notes.
Well, that's about right. You know, that sounds like that's definitely how I was then, and to an extent, sometimes how I can be now with preparing to write. You know, there's that. It's a Lincoln quote, isn't it? That 3/4 of cutting down the tree is sharpening the knife. Something like that. I'm probably misquoting, but the point stands is that I spend an awful lot of time sharpening that knife because I wasn't sure of my written voice and my tone, and I was second guessing myself, and I felt the best way to offset that was by being so prepared to have every angle covered that it would come out coherently in the end. And I think most of the time it did. I look back at stuff I wrote in those first couple of years when I was a hustling, bustling freelancer in the papers and the magazines, and that's pretty good work, I reckon. It took me a while to find my stride, find my phrasing and that type of thing, but once I got into it, I absolutely loved it. But I spent way, way, way too much time in hotel rooms or whatever at 2 a.m, having not filed. That was an affliction early on, which I thankfully no longer have. I mean, I can be a little bit, inclined to procrastinate if I've got a written piece, which is why I crave deadlines. And again, that's an ADHD thing. People with my hardwiring need deadlines, because if you allow us to drift on and on, we will drift on and on. That's just the way that it works, unfortunately. So having done books the last couple of years, the best thing for me with those books has been knowing that I had to have the manuscript filed by this date or the book wouldn't exist. So I think that's a helpful thing for me. And I know that now, and I can manage myself better accordingly.
In amongst all of that learning and sort of getting started in working in cricket media, tell me a bit about getting to know Geoff Lemon and then getting into the partnership with him that you've still got.
Yeah, so Geoff and I met online first, which is not unusual really these days, is it? But he and I had the same idea at a different time. In England in 2012, when I was living there during the Olympic Games, I occasionally was listening to a broadcast called Test Match Sofa, which was what it said. It did what it said on the tin, really. It was commentary of Test cricket by a bunch of people sitting on a sofa in London with my dear friend Daniel Norcross, who works
Pirate Radio, essentially.
Pirate Radio. He works for BBC proper these days, the real thing. We're rooming this week in Perth, actually, which is quite a nice full circle moment with him and me. But no, he was making that program, that Pirate Radio, and I thought that Australia was crying out for it. And I very, very loosely pitched it to the ABC in 2013, having had a really fun day out with a few ABC, those who were working at the ABC at the time, friends who loved their cricket. I think Steve Kinane, Francis Leach, Richard Hines. And I think I pitched at the time that, this could be a product in Australia as well. It could be like a red button cricket commentary alternative. If you're listening to the ABC, you can have the normal commentary or you can have the sweary one. And I thought I'd, do that and it'd be a laugh. Geoff had the same idea around the same time. He started a thing called White Line Wireless, which I really admired what he had done, which was exactly the same as Test Match Sofa when, as it turns out, the ABC had stopped going to overseas series at the time, and I thought that was wrong. So did Geoff. There was a a spirited debate in the National Senate on it. Actually, Senator John Faulkner was on his feet in Parliament discussing how it could possibly be that the ABC hadn't sent a commentary team to India in 2013, and Jeff had got wind of that and started his own pirate radio. So, yeah, that's where it began, our joint interest in that. We met at the Sydney Test in 2014 at the end of that Ashes series, my first writing about the game. We identified pretty early on that there wasn't much going on by way of cricket podcasting, and it took a while. We ended up making a cricket podcast for the ABC for a few years. Sadly, I don't think they ever really knew we existed. Certainly a couple of people in there were like, it was clear that we were way off Broadway. Like, we were not a priority, which is fine. We were new guys starting out, but we kind of realized over time that we would need to at some point go it alone. And yeah, that next phase started in 2018, which was the same time that I bought the radio rights for the Test series in Pakistan, which is a whole other story, really. And yeah, by that point, we realized that if we were going to do this podcast properly, we had to go all in. And 6 or 7 years later, we have been very much vindicated in that decision, because now the podcast gets made about 250 times a year, all different types of shows within the podcast feed. And yeah, we're really proud of the contribution that, we make to the conversation within that, and the different types of people we have on with us, including yourself, and the different types of stories that we're able to tell as an independent media outlet. And it's recognised fairly widely that we do well with it. And it's a source of pride.
We're talking to the cricket broadcaster and podcaster Adam Collins, who is also an author. And you and Jeff have just released a book called Bedtime Tales for Cricket Tragics, which it's a bit of a compilation of a segment on your show called Storytime. Yeah,
that's right. We make a weekend spin-off show which got really big in the pandemic when there was nothing to talk about the game. So we were telling the stories of the history of the game. It all started when one of our patron subscribers sent in a bespoke number about cricket as his crowdfunded contribution. It was 222 or 2 for 22, a tribute to Richie Benno. And, one thing rather led to another, as it does online. That one turning point meant that a whole bunch of our patrons decided to change their contributions to cricketing numbers, which became the catalyst for us to tell these stories. We've told about, I don't know, maybe 1,500 stories now on the program in long form style. And we picked out 22 of them to feature in what I'm calling the first edition of Bedtime Tales for Cricket Tragics, because there was so much great stuff left on the cutting room floor with this book in terms of which stories we had to omit, that I'm fairly bullish that if this does well, and we had a lovely launch in London last week and we've got one in Melbourne next week, that if this does what we want it to do, it could be the type of thing that we try and roll out each Christmas, which would be nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually a nice little segue to the other book that you've done, or I should say third book, because you also did one with Wayne Swan, didn't you?
Yeah, that was that 2014 year when I was just starting to write, and it was helpful that Wayne wanted me to ghost it for him, and it was helpful that I had that discipline of writing a book then. In the end, I didn't write the whole thing. We broke it up into a couple of chunks, but I wrote a really big slab of it, and then last year I went through that ghosting process with a cricketer for the first time.
Yeah, and that cricketer is Glenn Maxwell. Now, obviously, when you work in broadcasting or sports media, and you're traveling around a lot, you're spending a lot of time in close proximity to the cricketers or the athletes. Sometimes you'll hit it off with someone. You'll build a friendship. You'll build something that's a little bit more than a professional relationship. So tell me a bit about you and Glenn, and the fact that you're kind of kindred spirits in a way.
Yeah, maybe we are. You're right in your analysis, by the way, in your question there about it's impossible to remain completely dispassionate about all of your subjects. I reckon I'm pretty good with it. I reckon that when I'm commentating on Test cricket, as I will be through the summer, I don't get too wrapped up in the stories of the players when narrating the action. But it would be disingenuous to say that you don't feel more attached to some than others because you get to know them. It's the human condition that you develop bonds and links with people. And so it proved with Glenn. You know, I think that it probably started when I was writing these vitriolic articles about the injustice of how he'd been treated by the test selectors, going back some time now. And he'd already listened to our show a bit. He said he listened to it quite a lot, actually. And then we interviewed him at the 2019 World Cup. Now, what I didn't know and what I found fascinating through the book is that when he and I did that interview in 19 with Jeff in Bristol before that tournament, it wasn't long before he went into a full-on depressive spiral, and far more intense than people knew, like way, way worse than people realised at the time. Thankfully, he got on top of it and, you know, as you would hope most people would have the means to do. Of course, he had the support network of being an Australian cricketer, which you can't dispute the privilege there. But, you know, like, it's interesting. You go back and listen to that interview and you probably wouldn't pick up on any signs that he was about to go through a really, really tough period in his life. And it'd be naive to say that was cricket related alone. You know, people don't go into the funk that he went into because you're not making runs. That's a naive way of analysing the condition. So, yeah, anyway, you press fast forward and through the time of the pandemic and, you know, as these things do, right, you just become better friends with people over time. And he and I had spoken about making a documentary about his life. I had this recollection of a documentary that Shane Crawford subjected himself to in 2003 where he shot a lot of it himself on a handycam. It was a really brilliant bit of work the late Rob Dixon made with him. And I thought that could work really well for Maxi because he's never been shy about sharing his own story, right? He's brilliant at giving himself, and you've interviewed him lots as well. He gives loads at an interview, far more than the average bear, right? He's very happy to trust people with his story, whatever the story is at the time, you know? And I thought with that personality trait, he'd be brilliant at self-shooting and that type of thing. And the pandemic got in the way and it never really got off the ground, and that's fine. And then he came to me a couple of years on from that and said, what about a book? And it just happened to be that when we started those conversations, he went off to the 2023 World Cup and had the most extraordinary tournament. And at the end of that, it wasn't like Glenn and I talking about a book. It was more like publishers coming to him saying, you should do a book. And we were able to still stick to that year in the life of to a point because there was a really neat narrative arc where 360 days before, not quite 365, but 360 days before the 201 not out at Mumbai, the greatest one-day innings ever played, he snapped his ankle in two so badly that there was risk of amputation of his foot, again, which wasn't known publicly at the time. So there was this way of charting his recovery from a career-threatening injury, beyond career-threatening, foot-threatening injury, through and to the point where he was performing at the very peak of his powers exactly a year after that. And we were able to use that as the x-axis, and the y-axis was everything else in his life and the creative challenge and the project that we worked so hard on. How do we sprinkle the stories of his whole life through the x-axis? How do we find anchors to what's happened in the 12 months that we're identifying as this most important period, but not to brush over stuff that happened when he was a kid or when, he'd had these ups and downs through his professional career. So we tried to merge the two things together, and we were really proud of how it came up. Gideon Haigh, who I think everyone that works in cricket has such a high regard for, in his review of the book, describes the passage about him talking about that 201 not out as like Farlap describing how Farlap won the 1930 Melbourne Cup, which is a great line, right? Like you rarely get to hear an athlete voice just how they've done something in such great detail. And Maxi being Maxi, he remembers everything. He was able to give me so much detail that it was an absolute joy to pull it together.
I would hope that friendship and that relationship endures off into the future when he's no longer playing cricket. Yeah,
I've got no doubt that it will, and I'm very proud of him as a human. Like, I'm proud of him as a friend. Full stop. I love that he's loves the game so much. What's misunderstood about some cricketers, they play the game at a really high level, but they don't like it very much. He's the opposite. He's, it's no exaggeration to say that he's watched clips of my off breaks and provides me feedback, and and cares. It's not for effect. He's a cricket obsessive, and in the best traditions of cricket badges. And indeed, we called this book Bedtime Tales for Cricket Tragics. He's probably the kind of guy who would tear through it in a sitting because he likes the game so much, which is lovely.
We can't finish without talking a bit about the Ashes series, which has just gotten underway in Perth. The cricket's already started, but how do you see the 5 Test matches? How do you think it's going to go?
Well, I was really lucky 20 years ago to be at the first Test match at Lord's in the 2005 series, which is widely seen as the best, arguably the best ever, certainly one of the greatest ever. And this is the next most anticipated. So, sitting here in the build-up to that, and the build-up has been extraordinary. The volume of words that have been devoted to speculating about what might happen, unlike any other series I've been involved in my decade plus now in journalism. What I would say is that Test cricket could do with a series like 2005 again. The challenges for Test cricket that sit not far beneath the surface about the future of the game, about the challenge presented by not just domestic T20 cricket as we know it at the moment, but the proliferation of leagues, the price signals for players, the probable influx of Saudi Arabian money, which no one's really talking about. These will present challenges to Test cricket as a format. It won't eliminate it. Nothing will kill Test cricket, but it'll compromise what we love, a big, growing global game with Test cricket at its middle. This could change quite quickly, could change in the next 5 to 10 years. And what could help slow that change, or maybe deaden the hardest edges or something like that, or the sharpest edges, would be another belting series akin to what we had when India visited last year. So, yeah, we should be so lucky to have a series like 2005, but mostly as a Test cricket devotee, and I want this to be a part of my life forever, a series that's competitive all the way to Sydney would be a blessing. So, let's hope for that. And, my parochial interest to put well to one side, because my greatest interest of all when it comes to the game is seeing Test cricket especially continue to not just survive but prosper for generations to come, so that my little girls can grow up to love it as much as I do.
I've already said to a couple of colleagues, I'm kind of hoping or predicting that we'll have another 2-2 scoreline. What's your prediction?
Yeah, I've been trying to studiously avoid predictions. I've been predicting that not a single test will reach a 5th day, owing to the pitches that are likely to be served up. The 2-2 thing, there's been 2-2s in the last, would I be right in saying the last 3 Ashes series in England, which have been great. All 3 of them have been, most nourishing. 15 England won 3-2, didn't they? But in 2019 and 2023 series that we've covered together, there's not been a series that's been live in Australia between these nations going into the 5th test since 1982-83. That's the last time a series was live, the Ashes was live, going into the final rubber, if you like. That'd be a tremendous thing. If we all rock up at Sydney for the New Year's Test match, and we all go to Kirribilli House on New Year's Day, as we mentioned before, and these 2 teams have gone stroke for stroke to that point, it would be a massive story. It would be a story that would be the type that would sit in one of these books in 150 years' time. That's the nature of Ashes series, as they tend to anchor so much else of the cricketing conversation. So that's what I'm desperate for. I mean, however it starts here in Perth, so long as both teams get a really good look and both get a chance to get into the series, I think it'll be compelling viewing. It'll mean record attendances, record viewership, and hopefully inspiring generations to come that Test cricket is for them.
Adam, it's been a real pleasure to reflect on the past 10 years or so. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, let's hope that it's a terrific Ashes series for everyone to watch.
Indeed. Thanks, Dan. A pleasure.
That was cricket journalist and author and former political fixer Adam Collins, with chief cricket correspondent Dan Brettig for the latest Good Weekend Talks. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts, and keep tuning in for more compelling conversations. Coming soon, we chat to former AFL player Mitch Brown, who came out as bisexual in August, becoming the first publicly queer player in the league's 129-year history. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, proud newsrooms powered by subscriptions. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Conrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mumry. Our executive producer is Tammy Mills. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. And Melissa Stevens is the editor of Good Weekend.